Hello, my name is Deborah Russell. I want to thank you for your interest in consecutive interpreting. Our goal is to present a videotape. We'll provide you with information about consecutive interpreting and some samples of consecutive interpreting. And our hope is that will promote further discussion in the field. Let's begin by examining what consecutive interpreting is. When I use the term consecutive interpreting, what I mean is that we're using one language at a time. There's distinct pauses between the languages. Some people in our field believe that when you're using processing time, 6-7 seconds, that's actually consecutive. That's not what I mean by consecutive. When I'm using the term consecutive interpreting, I mean that the speaker has stopped, the interpretation is presented, the interpretation is finished, the speaker or signer continues. Consecutive interpreting typically requires that the interpreter know something about mapping or note-taking, and they may need to use those strategies in a given situation. As well, the interpreter will also need signals that tell people when they need to pause and for how long they need to pause for. Let's talk a little bit about the history of consecutive interpreting in our field. Despite plenty of evidence in the field of spoken language interpreting that consecutive is more accurate in just about every context possible, the field of sign language interpreting has predominantly used simultaneous interpretation. When we think about some of the reasons for that, I think that maybe the language pairs that we're using have contributed to that, in that the language pairs that we use, a spoken language and a signed language, don't have any overlap, so that you can be signing and I can be speaking at the same time, which isn't true for two spoken languages. So without that interference or without that overlap, I think that's contributed to our use of simultaneous interpretation. I think as well that we've used simultaneous for so long that we've perhaps not examined it critically enough. And finally, another reason that we continue to use simultaneous is that it's rewarded in our testing systems and our screening systems. Consecutive interpreting has a number of myths around it, and I'd like to explore some of those right now. Some people believe that consecutive interpreting is a stepping stone, that we use it in order to learn how to simultaneously interpret, but it's not a viable option to be used ever in your career again. There are others who believe that if you actually use consecutive interpreting, it must mean that you're not a very skilled interpreter. Some deaf people tell me that when they think about consecutive interpreting, they think that that's what their children did when they were interpreting for them. And the other myth that we have is that simultaneous is better because it's faster, it doesn't create any delays for people, and that it's accurate in all settings. However, we have some new research in our field that I think is worthy of examination. In my PhD study, I looked at courtroom interpretation and looked at 4 trials that involved criminal charges, so the consequences of errors was grave in those contexts. I also worked with teams of interpreters who were certified and experienced in legal settings. The study looked at 3 distinct discourse events: cross-examination, direct evidence, and expert witness testimony. The research results were surprising to me, but perhaps not surprising to others in our field. The 2 trials that used simultaneous interpretation achieved both an 87% accuracy rate and an 83% accuracy rate. Those trials that were conducted using consecutive interpreting enjoyed a 98 and a 95% degree of accuracy. And interesting enough, Dr. Burke Seligson, who works with Spanish-English interpreters, has done very similar research, and her results show that the simultaneous work of the Spanish-English interpreters was even more discouraging than the results shown in this study. When we look at the actual discourse events, so if I look at the expert witness testimony, in one of the trials, as much as 10% of that testimony was error-ridden. In the consecutive, you might have had 5 errors out of 292 utterances. So when you look at your handout accompanying this videotape, you'll see the error patterns for each of those discourse events. The discourse event known as direct evidence, and so by that I mean that the deaf person was providing their testimony. Out of 189 utterances, 39 of those utterances contained errors that were not corrected when done simultaneously, as opposed to 4 and 6 errors in the trials that were done consecutively. So we can see that the errors increase when we're using simultaneous and decrease when we're using consecutive, and that's in the hands of experienced and certified interpreters. I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of errors that occurred in those trials. One of the huge error patterns was that of omissions. And so when we're working simultaneously, our memory is maxed out and we start to lose information. And so there was huge omissions of content. One of the other patterns that emerged as well was a shift of tense, and so that events that were relayed that occurred in the past were actually spoken as if they were present tense. Shift of register, in that the spoken English in the courtroom was quite formal, consultative to formal, and when you looked at the interpretation, it would be casual in register. Deceptive work also appeared in the error patterns, in that work sounded like plausible English, sounded like appropriate English, but it wasn't at all the content that was presented in the source message. Dysfunctional grammar was the other piece that emerged in all of the errors, in that people were presenting work in their simultaneous work that didn't look like American Sign Language, it didn't look like good contact, it was a mix of something, but ultimately meant that the deaf person was tasked with trying to figure out what the interpreted message was. Finally, some other error patterns that emerged in the work. The work was very form-based when it was simultaneous, and by that I mean that it looked like English, like work. However, the consumers in these trials required American Sign Language. They were monolingual deaf persons who preferred American Sign Language, and that's not what they received in the interpretation. The interpretation was processed only at the lexical level, so a word-sign equivalency, which didn't reflect meaning-based work. As well, there were patterns of awkward English, which meant in the simultaneous work, interpreters were correcting themselves, but there was a whole process of false starts. They would start a message, correct it, restart it, recorrect it. And what that meant when we interviewed the lawyers and the judges after is that people questioned the credibility of the deaf witness, unfortunately, when it was a matter of interpretation. Finally, there were two other important error patterns that emerged. One of them relates to the narrative structure. So deaf people were telling complete narratives, retelling events that occurred to them. And the interpreters, when doing the work simultaneously, frequently missed the topic markers, or they missed the topic shifts, and they linked ideas in ways that were not found in the source language. And lastly, they skewed the perspective. And so if the deaf witness was retelling an event that involved multiple people and multiple perspectives on that event, that there was some skewing of whose perspective was being relayed at any given time. When I speak about the narrative structure, we know that there are 7 stages typically found in a narrative, whether it's in a signed language form or a spoken English form. And typically those 7 stages include an abstract, orientation, complicating action, a peak, evaluation, resolution, and coda. And the consecutive work certainly allowed for the 7 stages to be realized in the interpretation. The simultaneous, what we found is that the work often missed the complicating action. So in the case of a deaf witness talking about an assault, that would be the complicating action. And what it appeared to be in the simultaneous work is that the interpreters spent much more time on the orienting information. So they spent more time describing the house and all of the features where the assault took place, but they actually missed the transition and the important markers that spoke about the critical event. When we're thinking about legal contexts, the potential for complicating actions or new complicating actions to arise during cross-examination is great, and so that's where the interpreters really needed to rely on consecutive interpreting for some of that new information as well. When the work was successful, when interpreters did do successful work using consecutive, what we found was that it was processed at the sentential level. So as I said earlier, in the simultaneous work was word sign oriented. The processing level was much deeper when the interpreters used consecutive processing, and allowed for a complete contextual framing of all of the questions. And so if you're familiar with Anna Witte-Merethu's work, she speaks about syntactic framing, which is reestablishing the context of the original question, and the work reflected that when it was done consecutively. As well, when it was consecutive, the answers were actually linked to the questions, that we could follow the discourse and it made sense. The affect was accurate, and we noticed that in the consecutive work, the ASL prosody looked much more natural. So what we got was a natural cohesive text through the use of pausing and phrasing markers that looked visual in orientation, by the use of utterance boundaries, and by the use of discourse markers that we would expect to see in a signed language. And in the consecutive work, there seemed to be more effective monitoring as a team. When the work was done simultaneously, there were errors that were not corrected despite using a team situation, which is sometimes what we tell courts, is that we have to use a team situation so that we can monitor each other's work, but the reality showed that we aren't actually doing that. So for the legal setting, The results indicate that the entering of direct evidence is best accomplished by using consecutive interpreting, that when using cross-examination, that it is possible to do the work simultaneously because the information is not new. You're really going over ground that's been covered before, rather familiar to you. But if there's new information that arises during cross-examination, which is frequently the case, then the interpreter may then need to go back to using consecutive for those portions. And the expert testimony, given that it was detail-laden and had a number of cultural variables introduced in the testimony, required a blend of both simultaneous and consecutive. So the point of all of the research, I think, leads us to understand that consecutive is more accurate in a number of contexts, and it allows us to use all of the stages of processed models of interpretation. And so whatever model that you particularly use, whether that's Betty Kalonymus's or Dennis Coakley's or some of the other models that are available to us, the consecutive processing allows us the time that we need in order to work our way through those stages, and certainly reduces the impact of contact sign. We have some other research available to us as well too. When I was completing the PhD, I was then curious about how it is we teach consecutive interpreting, and so I did a pilot study of 15 interpreter education programs. And I wanted to examine how it is that we're teaching consecutive. Is it a tool to support simultaneous, or are we teaching it as a viable approach to be used throughout all stages of one's interpreting career? And all of the programs that I was able to include in the study reported using curriculum that teaches consecutive interpreting. But what varies is how that's taught. So for some programs, it's very much taught as a stepping stone, introduced in the first semester, never spoken about again. And then we had other programs that use consecutive interpretation throughout all of the semesters of the program, and that they support interpreters using it in a variety of contexts. Students in that study reported that they wanted to be able to use consecutive interpreting out on their internships and their practicums. However, they weren't supported by working interpreters. And the interpreting teachers reported using consecutive in their own freelance practices, but reported not demonstrating it into the classroom. So I think our field has a mixed reaction to consecutive. We have interpreters who are resistant to it. We have deaf community members, some who are familiar with interpretation and familiar with research and are open to its use. There are others who are not familiar with the research and who believe that simultaneous is the only way to go. And so it really very much depends on the interpreter and their knowledge about consecutive. Some people have asked me, if I get some training in consecutive, where would I actually use it? Let me give you some ideas about that. My sense is that we can be using consecutive throughout our entire careers, when we're working with children, when we're working with adults, when we're working with elderly. Some of the settings that I've used consecutive include courtroom settings, legal interviews, psychological appointments, counseling appointments, medical interviews, educational contexts, whether that's one-to-one interactions between teachers and students, whether that's small group presentations or projects. So I think that there are a number of settings that lend themselves to consecutive interpreting, and that we need to be guided by the discourse frame. So typically, one of the ways that I guide myself is that if it's a one-to-one interaction and it's an informational context, that typically that can lend itself to good use of consecutive interpreting. A number of interpreters have identified some decision-making frames that they use that allow them to make a decision whether they should use consecutive. One of the frames is that they look at the density of the information. So when the information is complex, multi-layered, rich in detail, culturally laden, that those are places in the text where they may revert to using consecutive interpreting. As well, the language of the consumer can guide us, so that, for example, when I'm working with elderly people, or when I'm working with children, or when I'm working with people who are new users of American Sign Language but have other forms of sign language perhaps, or have non-standard use of sign languages, all of those things help me to determine whether I should be using consecutive. I also want to use consecutive when I know that the consequences of my errors is grave, and so I particularly think about legal context, medical context, psychological context there. The other factor that interpreters have raised is that when the interpreter lacks a context for the situation, they'll often resort to consecutive. And it's interesting when they speak about context, because if we're going to get to meaning-based work, it has to be in a contextual frame, and that's one of the ways that they make that decision for using consecutive. What I want to say as well too is that when I speak about using consecutive, I'm not speaking about it as an either-or situation. There may be some situations where you start off using simultaneous, you move to using consecutive, and you might end off using simultaneous. An example of that might be a police interview, where I can predict the typical questions of the opening of that interview, so name, address, date of birth, where do you work? All of those questions don't need a whole lot of restructuring. I've interpreted those several times before. But when we actually start speaking about an alleged incident or a traffic accident or an incident that requires a great deal of description, that's where I need to use consecutive so that I can capture all of that information. Well, I think in order for us to incorporate the consecutive interpreting research into our field, one of the first things that we have to do is be able to learn to analyze our work accurately, and from a linguistic point of view and from a cultural point of view. I also think that we have to start to be more honest with our consumers, both deaf and non-deaf consumers, about the quality of our simultaneous work, about the rate of our errors, about the number of omissions that are found in our work when we work simultaneously. For those of you who are interpreters and you're interested in learning about consecutive, obviously what we need to do is we need to start to identify when we can be using it and how we should be using it. Some of the training that all of us require, we obviously need to look at our note-taking or our mapping strategies. We need to know how to chunk messages in appropriate places so that we're stopping people, asking them to pause in appropriate places. That we need to create signals that can be used with deaf people and non-deaf people. And we have to be able to work in a team context so that frequently I'm using consecutive, for example, when I work with a deaf interpreter, but that requires teamwork skills as well. And I think as well we need materials in our field that model the use of consecutive, and that's what you'll see on this videotape as well. I'll leave you with some recommendations this morning. One of my recommendations is that our interpreter education programs need to be built on a foundation of consecutive interpreting prior to learning simultaneous, and that we need to view it not as a stepping stone, but as a viable approach to be used throughout all aspects of our practice. I also think that as practitioners, we need to be able to support each other in using consecutive interpreting. And if our field is going to change dramatically, I think our accreditation and screening tools need to incorporate the use of consecutive interpreting in their one-to-one interviews. Interesting enough, in Canada, their new screening tools and the newest certification system will allow for consecutive processing during the one-to-one interviews. I'm going to leave it at that for this lecture and allow you now to watch some samples of consecutive interpretation. And after those samples, we'll have a chance to talk with the interpreters about their work. I want to thank the colleagues who participated in the research that led to our understanding of consecutive interpreting, and thank those interpreters who are going to work these samples for you today.